You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. Scott Merkin will join us on this episode today of Sox in the Basement. We'll have a long conversation as we're just a few weeks away from pitchers and catchers reporting, kind of dive into things the White Sox could still do and what the plan is with some of the personnel and the big stories that he's going to be watching. The Sox Nerd is going to check in as well. From what I understand, he has a very interesting take on the whole Mark Buehrle Hall of Fame debate. And otherwise, I'm doing the show on my own. Ed is not here. Now, luckily, he's not dead. My co-host and very longtime friend suffered a heart attack a couple of days ago. Don't worry, he's okay. He's in the hospital. He should be getting discharged today. He told me to tell everybody that the stress that Jerry Reinsdorf has put on him by owning this team for so many years finally almost killed him. So the sense of humor is also not dead. But keep him in your prayers. Hopefully a speedy recovery. He's chatting me up all day today on the text message from the hospital bed. Joining me on the phone line right now for this episode, our good friend, hasn't been on since the season ended, and I kept thinking to myself, we've got to get Scott Merkin on. How are you, Merk?
Good. I think we should tell the listeners that we just had a medical breakdown of all our ailments. I don't know how old you are, but I'm over 50, and when you get over 50, every day is a new kind of adventure. You know what I mean? Hey, you're glad to have it, right? You're glad to have every day you can have, but every day you're like, that back pain wasn't there yesterday, or the shoulder pain wasn't there yesterday, or so it was good advice from you, and off camera there, off mic.
Yeah, we were swapping medical stories off mic. All right, so I'm looking at this team. We're a couple of weeks away. What are we? 3 weeks away from pitchers and catchers? We're that close, right?
3 weeks from the sun. It's February 9th is when I'm going out there, and then February 11th is when Chris Getz talks to the media. 12th is when pitchers and catchers are reported. It seems like it was just a week ago when that final game in Detroit took place, but it wasn't, clearly. Yeah, well, Getz has been out there a little bit in the last week or so, giving a few interviews and talking about his team, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot more when you get to spring training. The interesting take that I got from some of the things that he said recently is it seems as though he knew his owner wasn't going to spend. And maybe the past regime was always just hopeful they were going to get a little bit more than what they were going to get from ownership. He seems to have a very good grasp on this is all I'm going to get. So I'm going to invest my time and the money I get into bringing in new front office personnel, changing the international setup when it comes to scouting and how they're going to go out in the international free agency. You know, I think they're building a facility down in the Dominican. Like he seems to be focusing on the infrastructure because it wouldn't make sense to try to go out and spend a ton of money if the owner isn't fully committed. Is that what you're getting as well? I would say that, Rick and Kenny certainly were not oblivious to what, Jerry gives them a budget. Sometimes you can finesse around the budget. We heard, the story in 2005, how Kenny went to Jerry and said, we need a Gucci. I've watched this guy on video and, this is going to be a guy that's going to make a difference. And damn, if he wasn't right, Gucci was a huge cog in that 05 championship, and they went over budget to get that. And they've gone over budget before. I think this time, just with the last 2 years coming off COVID in 2020, they just weren't spending this time around, and Chris knew that. And I'm not sure if the infrastructure was a byproduct of that. I mean, they're in a rebuild, whether they said it from the beginning or not. They are in, now they've kind of, claimed that they're in a rebuild. You don't trade away a 25-year-old pitcher who is going to be one of the best starters in baseball as long as he stays healthy. Absolutely. I have no doubt that Garrett Crochet will be consistently one of the best starters for 4 prospects if you're not in a rebuild, right? I mean, that you don't trade away Dylan Cease for, a couple prospects if you're not in a rebuild. It's all a process. I like what Chris is doing in terms of the front office people he's brought in. Will Venable, I think, was their number one guy to take over as manager from Pedro Grifol and then Grady Sizemore, who's still on staff. And, they've improved the infrastructure across the board, which I think they believe will help them develop some of these young players they have in there. But I'm not sure that, Chris was more aware than Rick or Kenny. I just think that this time the budget was going to be lower and they had to operate accordingly, to go with that.
You mentioned Grady Sizemore. You're around the team all the time covering them for MLB.com. You've been doing it for decades. How surprised were you? Were you surprised at all that a guy who was the interim manager for the last couple months was kept on staff. That's very unique, isn't it?
Very interesting overall in that Grady Sizemore was the interim manager. And from what I understand, and, Chris really hasn't specified like any kind of final list or anything, but was in very serious consideration for the managerial job. Phil Nevin, also in, strong consideration for the managerial job, and Sergio Santos, who interviewed for the managerial job. All three have positions in the organization. Phil is a special assistant, going to work on the minor league and major league side. Sergio has moved up to AAA manager after winning the Southern League title with AA, and then Grady is the offensive coordinator, which, everyone who's seen the title has, probably even Grady has said, they're going to run the option or they're going to run the pistol or whatever, offensive coordinator. Get it? You fouls it football.
I got it.
We'll see. We'll see what that title exactly plays out in when we talk to him and when it gets to spring training and we can see, his bit. But I do know that players loved him last year. I mean, the record was still bad, but it was a bad team. Let's be honest. Nothing against the guys who busted their ass every day trying to play well and trying to win. It was a bad team. They lost 121 times. They were historically bad, but the players really responded to Grady, and he had an influence on them. I can't tell you the amount of guys who told me, how they respected the way he carried himself as a player. Not any of them saw him really, but thinking back and reading about it, maybe a few saw him, but just the impact he had. And apparently he had an impact before that, just kind of quietly behind the scenes as the major league coach. So I think it makes sense to keep him on. I mean, I know people are arguing about, they have the hitting coach back in Marcus Thames, who, the worst offense in baseball. Well, it's not totally his fault on that, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, it's probably just like hitting coach, as Paul Konerko once said, in baseball is probably the worst job in sports, because if you hit well, the players are great. If the team struggles, the hitting coach is awful, So there's no win there. So we'll see what happens. This is not a team built to contend this year. At least on paper, it doesn't look that way. This is just a year or two of the rebuild. They're going to give prospects a lot of chance, a lot of leeway to play. So we'll see what happens. So I think it's not a bad idea to have coaches they are familiar with on Will Venable's first staff.
You mentioned the hitting coach situation. I'm more interested in the idea that they've brought in Ryan Fuller and essentially the guy in the Brian Bannister role for pitching. Like, he's the hitting czar, I mean, like, is that one of the big stories? Because I think a lot of White Sox fans noticed a difference in the idea that the team had a set philosophy and somebody overseeing the development of pitchers. And there were some bright spots even in that bad season. And they're probably going to be looking for the same kind of thing to start happening with either prospects or underperforming players from last year. And they're going to be looking at Fuller. Is that one of your big storylines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge addition in the sense that you have one for each discipline now. I mean, I don't know if you need a defensive coach in the same way, but Brian Bannister is brilliant at what he does. He's been outstanding. He's been well known even before he came to the White Sox. I think, players obviously deserve credit for their development too, but I think Brian and his crew have pointed some pitches in the right direction. And, being honest, the pitching prospects are ahead of the hitting prospects right now across the White Sox for the most part. So we'll see what Fuller can bring. Don't know a ton about him aside from what we've heard from him and what we've read about him. And he was, in charge of one of the guys working with a lot of the young top prospects at the Orioles. So we'll see how that transfers to the Sox. But it's good to have that equal footing and that, that point man in each for hitting and pitching. And as you said, what Bannister did paid, strong dividends in his first couple of years of the team. So we'll see what Fuller can do now.
As we talk with Scott Merkin from MLB.com, a reminder that for exterior windows, doors, patio doors, and storm doors, look no further than Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest. Instead of somebody showing up with a dingy example window and traipsing all kinds of mud and snow and slush into your living room, putting his feet up on the couch, forget that. You go in and see them in their showroom, everything's there. You get it all in full color, full size, all the little etchings in the windows and doorknob options. It's not in a magazine. It's right there for you to look at. And you can ask the owner right there in the showroom all about it. There's also an owner on site with all installs and all Window and Door Superstore installers. They never farm out the work. That way, they get it done right. They've been doing it that way in Oak Forest since 1985 with all major brands custom made and no stock items for a perfect fit. Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest is a half block east of 159th and Ridgeland at 6280 159th Street. See more at windowdooroakforest.com. We have a couple of theories we bounced around here in the offseason about the clubhouse and the way that the team is looking at certain players. And two names that we've talked about a couple times, Luis Robert Jr. and Andrew Vaughn. Now, Vaughn over the last couple of years has essentially been a replacement level player, and you gave him around $6 million in arbitration this year, when you could have made an argument of changing it up at that position, because he's never really become what the hype was. But he was perceived to be a guy that was really trying hard even down the stretch in a bad season. Meanwhile, you got Luis Robert Jr., who may be your most talented player, but didn't look like he was always at 100%. Sometimes he's up there just swinging to get back to the bench, and you hear them talking about the possibility of moving him when he may actually be at a lower value than what he would be if he came out and started hitting in the first couple of months. Can you talk a little bit about those guys? It's interesting to me they bring back Vaughn when you could have made the argument not to do it, but that they're trying to move on from Robert even if he's not at his max value.
Well, I think, first of all, I think it is value overall. I think, nothing against Andrew, but Luis Robert's going to have a higher trade value. Luis Robert is a Gold Glove center fielder. Luis Robert is a 25 to 30 stolen base guy. Luis Robert has hit 36 homers in a season and 38 doubles, and he can hit for average when he's on his game too. So there you go. They're about the same age. I think maybe Robert's I think they're really right about the same age. So even coming off a bad season, I think his value is higher. Number two, I think Luis Robert, works as hard as anyone. Right? And you hear things from players, from coaches, and everything else, and I've heard nothing but Luis Robert is a diligent worker. It's just tough when you're hurt every year. It's the 1 year that he was, a couple of years he was 100% healthy. He was lights out. His season in 23 was about as complete a season I've seen from a White Sox player. This will be my third season in all the years I've covered the team. So I don't think it's fair to paint him as not in there. I think, he had no protection. He had very little protection in that lineup. And they were, they found, I happened to see, I met up with Aaron Rowan when I was out in Las Vegas, and Aaron Rowan worked a lot with Luis when he was still with the organization. And he talked about, number one, about how talented the kid is, off the charts, and how hard a worker he is, but also the league figures you out, And I think it's been pretty much assembled that if you can get Luis Robert to chase, you stay out there, right? You keep getting him to chase until he doesn't chase anymore. When he stops doing that, he's a really, really tough out and a really dynamite player who's a force to be watched, And I will also say on Vaughn, I get that Vaughn has not been, I always get this mixed up, but either he was 3 or 4 and Madrigal was the other one, but has been a 3rd or 4th pick in the draft overall. But Vaughn's numbers are not atrocious. It's not like the guy's hitting 190 with 5 homers and 20 RBIs. He has been up near the top of the team in home runs and RBIs and just, has not been able to get over that hump to get him to like elite level, I guess you would say. He did have a solid second half. That was part of the whole rough start to last season. They had no room for error and they had nothing but error. Robert got hurt. Jimenez got hurt. Moncada got hurt, all in the first, 10 days of the season. And Moncada and Robert were extended injuries. Vaughn and Benintendi, by their own admission, struggled mightily in the first half and then played much better in the second half. But they were in a hole right from the beginning. So, I still talk to people who think that Vaughn has got the potential to be a standout player. Maybe this will be the year. Maybe this is the year he breaks through. It's certainly not like he's a 10, 12-year veteran where you're like, this is what you get from him. I think he's been in the league 4 years. And the first year he was an outfielder based on a week of spring training and a week of the alternate site camp in COVID year. So you have that in your mind going through while you're trying to hit on top of everything else. So I understand why they brought him back. I think he's still of value, and he may end up being another guy who, if he takes off in the first half of the season and the team is not competitive, who can draw some interest. I know he drew some interest at the trade deadline last year, but we'll see if that plays out again this year. So I would say that I understand both moves, but I think, they're not going to trade Robert unless they get the full value they believe they should for him. So this is not a move where they're like, we have to get rid of him before spring training starts. They are going to wait, and if the offer comes that matches what they want, what they believe, they will move him then.
The infield's a little cluttered. I don't know how exciting all the players are in it, but they've got a lot of them. Miguel Vargas, Brian Ramos, Andrew Vaughn, Lenyn Sosa, Brooks Baldwin. Colson Montgomery has been hyped a little bit by the general manager, is going to probably get a shot here in spring training. You just picked up Josh Rojas. Chase Mydroth was picked up, and Chris Guest recently talked about what a talented player he is, and he's a hard out, and he's going to have an opportunity. And I know I'm probably missing 3 or 4 more. They don't have a lot of room. So do you think this is going to be open competition, or do you think the team already knows who those four main infielders are?
I think it's always talked about in open. I remember Pedro Raffol talking a few years ago about how every, or maybe it was last spring, where, hey, this is open competition. Nobody's got a roster spot. Well, Luis Robert had a roster spot. Andrew Vaughn had a roster spot. It's a good quote to see out there for the team, although I'm not even sure if the fans bought that at that point. But, there are certain guys who are on there. But I think there are going to be some spots that are going to be decided, and not necessarily by results in spring training, by what they see on the field, approach, the way they handle the positions and that sort of thing. I really do believe, though, that Colson, who I know did not have a good overall year at Charlotte, but had a good finish to the year and then continued that on in the Arizona Fall League for a short time, I really do believe he's got a shot to break camp as a starting shortstop. I really think that's possible. And if not, break camp, come up very shortly thereafter. So I think they're all, Josh Rojas is going to be on the team. Miguel Vargas is going to be on the team. And then I think from there's a lot of wait and see what happens and kind of sorting it out. And yeah, I'm sure between themselves, between Chris and Jin Wong and Josh Barfield and Fuller and everyone else, they've probably, kind of said, well, I bet we think this guy has a leg up or this guy doesn't. And I know they won't go based totally on just if Colson goes or Madroth goes and hits 420 in spring. They're not going to be like, okay, put him on the team. They're going to wait. They're going to see the process and how it gets there. But I do think there is going to be a lot of open competition for a very few spots there.
Really interesting. Look, I got to tell you, I look at this team, and one of the things that I'm curious about is Chris Getz's and the rest of the guys. I mean, it seems like he's got a lot of people he's brought in from the outside, and he asks their opinion. Like, he's going to make the decision, but he listens to the people around him, his experts. And it'll be interesting to see at this point in the rebuild how quickly they're going to elevate prospects, right? You got two good prospects in Caro and Teal that are at the catcher position. Do one of them even have a chance to break camp, or will they hold them down? Like, how do you see it happening? Is this going to be, if a guy impresses right now who's sitting at that AAA level, can he actually make the team coming out of camp, or are we going to see this more of a midseason trickling out of prospects that we've been reading about?
I think it probably depends on the prospect. I mean, right now behind the plate, you have veteran-ish guys in Matt Theis and Corey Lee, right, who could hold the spot if you feel like coming out of, March that, okay, Caro and I would say Teal is probably not going to break camp with the team. But I think Caro, who was with the team for the final week of the season, part of the taxi squad, could be a guy who could, possibly make it out there. But we'll have to wait and see on that. I think guys are going to be given a chance, but guys certainly won't be rushed. We were talking to Sergio Santos recently, and then Paul Janisch, who does a great job as director of player development. Sergio was talking about Noah Schultz, and Paul was talking about Hagen Smith, who he said about Hagen Smith, who probably has the stuff right now to pitch at the big league level, but they're not going to rush him. And the same with Noah Schultz, who, again, has got to get his probably pitch total up a little bit. He was basically pitching a college Friday night starter schedule last year, right, where he pitched a certain amount of hitters, a certain amount of innings, a certain amount of pitches, and that was it, no matter what inning it was. And they usually try to keep about 4 innings. So you see him build up. But what's the point of rushing, especially if you don't believe that this year, 2025 is going to be a prime contending year, which does not appear to be. But with that said, I would not be surprised to see both of them at some point pitch in the majors this year. So it's kind of a balance. I think it just depends on the guy and the fit and what they've done and, where they're at in terms of preparation, and more so than anything else, how they'll handle failure once they get to the big level, because that's obviously a big part of your major league career.
Mark, before I let you go, I got to ask you what you think it's going to be like at Camelback Ranch here in a couple of weeks, because the Dodgers crowd will probably be a little bit different than the White Sox crowd out there.
Yeah, I was talking to some other media members, and if Sasaki does sign there, then, there could be anywhere from like 100 to 200 reporters there every day for, maybe not every day, but quite a few days. And there may be about 4 or 5 on the Sox side there, and that's not even taking a shot at the Sox. They're just in different positions, right? The Dodgers are the defending World Series champions. Their 8th guy in the lineup would probably be the star of 15 to 20 teams in baseball. And the Sox are a team that's rebuilding, and they hope to be at that level maybe in 2 years, where people will come to see them too. It's not like they're not going to go see the Sox. I'm just saying on a regular basis with that kind of star power, that place could be loaded on the other side of Camelback Ranch. Should make for some interesting crossover games at Camelback Ranch as well.
You think Getz is going to add any other guys? Is there a position that you're looking at? You're like, maybe they'll still, because I feel like there's still one or two, and nothing big, just filling in and getting more like replacement level or veteran players that to kind of fill in around the young guys until they're ready.
Maybe another reliever. I mean, you have Martin Perez now, so I don't think you need another starter. You have the starters in place there. Maybe a left-handed bat, depending on how you want to use DH, and with the guys you talked about, do any of them fit into a DH role while playing in the field part-time? So something along those lines. And it could come from non-roster invites, which I expect to be announced before Sox Fest on the 24th. So you never know. There could be a guy or two that comes on that list that jumps in.
Scott Merkin from MLB.com, nice enough to jump on Sox in the Basement. Thanks so much, Merk.
Sure, anytime.
Joining me on the phone line right now, the Sox Nerd. He puts up all the tidbits on the scoreboard at the rate. He is very soon going to be back to work and preparing for the season. Dave Marin is on the line with us right now, brought to you by the Village of Lamont. Want to experience a downtown with real history, great eats and drinks, and green spaces filled with adventure? Visit the Village of Lamont. Shop, dine, drink, explore, and see everything they have going on this weekend and beyond at lamontdowntown.com. Nerd, what do you got for me?
Chris, when we chat next week, we will know who the next members of the Hall of Fame are. The Baseball Writers Association will reveal their latest class on Tuesday. My guess is first-timer Ichiro Suzuki is voted in unanimously, while Billy Wagner, CC Sabathia, another first-timer, and ex-Sox outfielder Andrew Jones will get the necessary 75% of the vote to get in. Speaking of former Sox players, this is Mark Buehrle's fifth year on the ballot. He started strong by earning 11% of the vote in 2021, then dropped to 5.8%, then rose to 10.8% in 2023 before dipping to 8.3% last year. It's really difficult for legacy White Sox players to be voted into the Hall of Fame. Only two, Frank Thomas and Jim Thome, were elected on the sacred first ballot. Even Carlton Fisk, one of the greatest catchers of all time, had to wait a year before getting the call. The rest, like Appling, Aparicio, Baines, Fox, and Minoso, had to wait or were elected by the Veterans Committee. That's probably where Buehrle is headed. Is he a Hall of Famer? Not in a Tom Seaver or Randy Johnson sense, but there are many categories, stats, and achievements where Buehrle is right there with or better than some Hall of Famers. I mean, Nolan Ryan never pitched a perfect game or won a Gold Glove. Ferguson Jenkins never won a World Series. But there is a clause in the Hall's voting rules that speaks to the player Buehrle was. After the on-the-field language, the clause says, quote, voting shall be based upon the player's integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams on which he played. If that doesn't say Mark Buehrle Hall of Famer, I don't know what does. Best case scenario for Buehrle is that his vote total goes up to increase his visibility and his totals rise over the next few years. This is the path Dawson, Raines, Rice, and Larry Walker took to Cooperstown. This will also help his chances in his post-Writers Hall of Fame career. Worst case scenario for Buehrle is that he does not receive the necessary 5% to stay on the ballot, and we don't hear from him again. Speaking of getting dropped, I'm still irked that Paul Konerko only garnered 2.5% of the vote in 2020, his only year on the ballot. The fact that A.J. Pierzynski, who is fifth all-time among catchers with 1,991 hits, only got 2 votes in 2022 is also a head-scratcher. Before I get to my zinger, I remind you that gems like these and long-form pieces are on my blog, which you can link to at soxinthebasement.com. Not a zinger, but a tribute this week. Longtime Brewers broadcaster Bob Uecker passed Thursday. His skill as a play-by-play announcer, coupled with his knowledge of the game, storytelling ability, and most of all, his sense of humor, made him the best radio announcer in Major League history. He was so important to the Brewers and to Milwaukee. It's kind of like what Harry Carey was to the Sox in the 1970s without the bombast. Stretch that impact over 6 decades, and that's what Uecker meant to the Brewers and Milwaukee. My wife and I met him once at the park in a more nerve than brains moment. This was 2018, and Bob was making a rare appearance on the road to honor the retiring Hawk Harrelson. Following the quick pictures, I said, quote, have fun with Hawk today. His response, I thought it was Andre Dawson. It was so Uecker. We thought we were getting our own private joke, but I see Scott Merkin of WhiteSox.com posted a similar story. Let's just say we heard that crack first. That's it, Chris. probably more than you wanted to know about the Hall of Fame, good old number 56, Paulie, and the legend of Bob Uecker.
Thank you, Nerd. And that pretty much is going to wrap up the show. I want to get into what Merk talked about a little bit right now, and then we're going to save it, really, for discussion when Ed gets back in here, because I know he really wants to be back on the show by the next episode. And the latest update I got is that he's doing well and should be out of the hospital here by the time that the show is airing. So what did I glean off of what Scott Merkin said? What I got was that Andrew Vaughn's your first baseman, Miguel Vargas is making the team, and so is Josh Rojas, and Colson Montgomery, if he doesn't break camp, likely going to be there at the beginning of the season early on. That's the infield. That means anybody else trying to break in there has to be like the fifth infielder, or has to be somebody that's like the super utility guy, or has to move somebody into a DH role sometimes, and sometimes they're in a DH role. And you think about all those names, Mydroth and Sosa and Ramos, like there's going to be a lot of guys trying to get in there, but the smart money, unless somebody steals a job, is on those names that he mentioned. And I also got a little bit of hope, at least based upon what he knows about the clubhouse, that Luis Robert Jr. is going to come out and be good Luis Robert Jr. to start the year, which probably is going to get him traded by the deadline. And for some reason, the COVID years are still hurting the White Sox as a business. I don't know if you noticed that, but they may not be spending because of that still. So small businesses like restaurants and Jerry Reinsdorf, they're all hurting the same, I guess. I'm not blaming Merk for that. If he's hearing something and he's relaying it, it isn't him that's making that excuse. Somebody on the team must be making that excuse to the pool reporters. Get well soon, Ed. I can't wait to talk to you about this stuff on the next episode of Sox in the Basement.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.